Good evening, and welcome back to the 12th Annual Untold Nauvoo Stories Symposium. My name is Joseph Johnston, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our second evening of the 2022 Untold Nauvoo Stories. We greatly appreciate you joining us this evening to listen to another night of fabulous Nauvoo history. Tonight's gathering will not be possible without our generous sponsors, and I would like to take a moment to extend our gratitude to the City of Nauvoo, the Nauvoo Area Chamber of Commerce, the Nauvoo Tourism Office, the Joseph Smith Historic Site, and Historic Nauvoo. Thank you very much for your continued support. Now let me tell you what you can expect this evening. I'll wrap up my remarks about 7:05 p.m. Central Time. Our first guest speaker, Randall J. Soland. Randall will share for approximately 40 minutes. His presentation is titled Nauvoo's Town Characters and Businesses of the 1960s and 1970s. Following Randall's presentation, we will then hear from Michael Allen as he shares Rivertown, Boats and Boating in Old Nauvoo. Following this second presentation, we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. Our evening program will then finish around 8:45 p.m., making for another enjoyable evening of Nauvoo history. Before we begin, a few friendly reminders. We are using the webinar format in Zoom, a program designed specifically for features like this. Only the guest speaker and the hosts have the video feature, so you will not be seen. However, there is plenty of time for you to share with one another through the chat feature that you can find down at the bottom. We encourage you to take full advantage of this feature throughout the lecture tonight and consider introducing yourself and where you're from and let the group know what you're thinking. I also anticipate that tonight's presentation will inspire a lot of wonderful questions from the audience. Please post your questions throughout tonight's program in the Q&A feature that appears at the bottom of the screen. That is the Q&A feature, not the chat, but the Q&A. When the two presentations conclude, we will go first to the questions already in the queue. Now, for our first presentation this evening, our presenter, Randall J. Soland, grew up in Nauvoo. He is a private practice counselor and historian in Springfield, Illinois. He loves Nauvoo and its history and is an annual Untold Nauvoo Stories. He is the author of the book, Utopian Communities of Illinois, Heaven on the Prairie. His wife, Jody, have recently purchased their forever home in beautiful Nauvoo. Randy, up to you.
Hello, everybody. I want to apologize first for not having my usual makeup artist here to powder my forehead to avoid the glare for everybody. But so anyway, on with the show, as they say. Nauvoo's Town Characters and Businesses during the 1960s and 70s, a presentation for Nauvoo's Untold Stories, February 5th, 2022. Small towns tend to produce more than their share of interesting personalities. I lived in Nauvoo from 1953 to 1972 until leaving for college. When people asked me what was it like to grow up there, I always replied, "Did you ever see the Andy Griffith Show?" Certain people were labeled the town's drunks, crazies, gurus, healers, eccentrics, gossips, helpers, teachers, and spiritual leaders. However, in spite of some of the negative connotations of those labels, there was always a different underlying meaning and understanding. One of acceptance of, tolerance for, amusement with, protective watchfulness over, respect, and love for. As you can see a little picture there from the Big Lebowski, The Dude Abides. I think we first need to define what is a character. According to the Webster Dictionary, a character is a person known for certain notable or conspicuous, desirable or undesirable traits. The law. Mayberry had Andy and Barney. During the 60s and 70s, Nauvoo had City Marshal Richard Yeager and Trooper Richard Kapowick of the Illinois State Police. Both these guys were very fair and upright men. Many of us thought that Trooper Kapowick looked like Telly Savalas on Kojak, and we thought that Marshal Yeager looked like Kent McCord who was Jim Reed on Adam 12. The Drunks, Otis Campbell on Mayberry, played by Hal Smith. Fun fact, Hal Smith never drank. Otis used to say, "Barney, right now I'm dead sober, but I expect to get over it." In Nauvoo, we had Bob Cornflake Kellogg. He was a brilliant chemist who worked at Scheller Globe in Kilcock and owned and ran the Pioneer Motel, now the Motel Nauvoo at 1610 Mulholland. Because of his alcoholism, he drove off the Mississippi River 7 times on the river road from Nauvoo to Hamilton, never getting hurt once. Many people don't know the backstory of Bob's first driving drunk experience on the same road with his high school sweetheart, crashing into the river the first time. He came out unscathed, but she died. My theory is PTSD. Then we have the Lemon Lard, the Hager twins. The Hager twins served in the Navy 1941 to 1961. They worked at the cheese factory 1961 to 1978. After their shift at the cheese factory, they always went to Dottie's for food and drink. They had reserved seats at the bar, which you better not sit in one of their seats. They would give some of their business to Bunch and Jim's bar at 1310 Mulholland, now a vacant lot, owned then by Norm and Millie Bossler. The Darlings on Mayberry, these now were going into the Crazies. Ernest T. Bass on Mayberry. Andy said about Ernest, "Bass is a strange and weird character." Barney replied, "I think he's just a nut." On Nauvoo, we had Major Simmons. Looking back, I would say Major suffered from severe PTSD from World War II. He was really only a private, but he had everybody call him Major. He would wander around Nauvoo and talk a lot, usually a mile a minute. He was always ready to help anybody with a project. His main modes of transportation around town were his 2 feet and a riding lawnmower. Major was known to say, there are a lot of crazy people in Nauvoo, but I'm the only one that gets paid to be crazy. He had a disability check coming in. Then we had Zippy up here on the right, as you can see, Johnny Knoxville in the movie The Ringer. I can count the potato. Zippy worked for Dottie Herbert at the Red Front. He was the main gopher and busboy. Dottie always watched out for him, providing him not only a job, but gave him free food and housing. Looking back, I would say that Zippy was developmentally delayed. Now, if you ate at the Red Front and Zippy was around, you had to be careful and not go to the bathroom, because if you left, Zippy was likely to take your whole plate of food and throw it in the garbage. He was always ahead of the curve. Then we have the Grumps. Aunt Bee is seen here with her best friend, Claire Edwards Johnson, on the Andy Griffith Show. Andy's parents had died. Aunt Bee was Andy's paternal aunt. Aunt Bee's main job was taking care of Andy and Opie. Opie once said she sure kicks up a fuss when a fellow gets his clothes tore up and messy. Aunt Bee would respond, "Oh, fibberly gibbet." Then you have up here, you see the picture of grumpy old men with Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon. In Nauvoo, our grumps were Dottie Herbert, and that's a pretty good picture of Dottie. The Red Front, located at 1305 Mulholland, now owned by the Squires, Morgan and Jordan. Dottie and Merle Herbert ran the Red Front. She was the boss at home and certainly at the bar. Dottie was there 7 days a week. She was known not ever to really trust anybody and seldom smile. If I went in there as a kid, I always worked hard to try to get a smile from her. She provided great food and drink to all who came in. A Catholic, she once said, "In hard times when most people aren't drinking so much in Nauvoo, I can always count on my fellow Catholics in town to keep me in business." Then we have Tom Moffat. Moffat Standard Station in Nauvoo. Tom was born and raised in Nauvoo. He was a World War II veteran. Tom ran Moffat's service station from 1959 to 1979. He gave a lot of the boys in the area their first paying job. Tom was also a member of Saints Peter and Paul Church and a Knight of Columbus. Tom was known as a tightwad. Tom was known as a tightwad. He had a dark and wicked sense of humor. In hindsight, he probably also had undiagnosed obsessive compulsive disorder. He would often say, "I only want 1 can of Busch Light and 3 Pringles." Not 1 Pringle, not 2 Pringles, 3. I once purchased something from him, but I was short a penny. In spite of being liked by him and a friend to his kids, I still had to drive to my parents' farm 3 miles away to get that penny and bring it back to him for the purchase. Moffat's Standard Station was located at 1395 Mulholland, now the empty Sinclair Station. Now we get into the eccentrics. Mr. Mabeeby on Mayberry. Opie tells Andy and Barney about the man in the woods who is on top of the trees and jingles. Andy thinks Opie has an imaginary friend, but in reality, he's really a lineman. My mom, Margie Solon. She was married to my dad, Robert. Margie loved music and was a good piano player, yet her singing voice sounded like Edith Bunker. My mom was the oldest of 6 children. She was used to being in charge and getting things done. She was extremely kind and religious, only hearing her cuss once after I slammed a kneeling pew on her foot in church. There were a few cuss words that came out of her mouth on that incident. She had a hypnotic quality about her whereby she could get anybody to do her bidding. To this day, I still don't fully understand it. For example, once my wife and I came over to see her, it was in a cold January or February day, much like today. Outside, I saw the mail truck parked by the mailbox. My wife and I went inside the house, and I saw the mailman actually dusting and vacuuming the house. I asked him, "What are you doing?" He replied, "I didn't want your mom to walk to the mailbox, slip, and break her hip, so I wanted to bring the mail in to her. Next thing you know, she's got me cleaning the house. Now, I'd like to stay and visit with you, but I've got to finish the job here and then deliver the mail." Another example, she would go to a gas station where the sign would say, "Turn off your engine, self-serve, no checks." She would simply pull up, leave her car running, get somebody to come out, pump the gas, and write a check and drive away. Margie could pull up to the red front and get curbside service by simply honking her horn. Louis Wildhaber. Louis was a lifelong confirmed bachelor. He knew all the kids and teens in Nauvoo and even who the teens were dating. He ran a general store where the Nauvoo tourism office is now, located at 1295 Mulholland. He held poker games in the back of the store for men. He would give kids free candy and teenagers free cigarettes and condoms, believing a lot in birth control ahead of his times. Louis particularly enjoyed teasing all the St. Mary's Academy girls. They teased him right back. One could hear a Louis sneeze up and down all of Mulholland. Famous Louis sayings: "Tell me what you need. I'll call my friends up in Burlington, the mafia, of course, and they will have it here for you in 24 hours. And by gosh, there was always something, whatever it was you needed, you would have it in 24 hours. Who will carry on this noble work?" was another one of his sayings, "after I'm gone." In the movie Easy Rider in 1969, there was Billy. Nauvoo had Rick Smith, also known as Groovy. Rick still lives in his childhood home on the River Road. The story goes one day he came into Nauvoo High School and announced, "From now on, my name is Groovy," and so it was thereafter. Rick was and is known for driving his muscle cars and awesome motorcycles. He's the only guy I ever knew who had to go to a dentist to get part of a metal beer can out of his teeth. He used to find it amusing to just bite into one after finishing his beer. Once after an accident, he had the gall to tell me, "Solon, you need to talk to your St. Mary's Academy girlfriend about paying for the mirror on my bike," which she broke off when I accidentally struck her while cruising by St. Mary's Academy on my Harley. You can see Groovy in the 2017 documentary film called Drifting Toward the Crescent. Then there was Mr. George Huffman, Nauvoo's shoe sales and shoe repair shop owner. He lived on the flats. He kept a monkey in his shop who amused all the children when their parents took them there. The monkey was dressed daily and had free roam of the store. You were allowed to feed him a peanut or two. Then there was Frank Terry. Frank could create Nauvoo's only traffic jams any time of year, but especially during the Grape Festival. He would drive his huge Cadillac about 30 miles an hour into town. Once he would get a meal at Krause's cafeteria, which was his usual place to hang out. He would then pull away his car from his favorite parking spot, bumping the bumpers of the cars parked in front and back of him. Amazingly, back then, no significant damage was ever done to the bumpers. During Grape Festival weekends in the 70s, he could back up traffic all the way on Route 96, all the way to Hamilton or Nyota. That was when 50,000 people would often come for the 3-day festival. Then we have Estelle Neff, who ran Neff's bookstore. Estelle and his wife Cecil ran the bookstore for 63 years. He would often just leave the store with customers to give them personal tours of Nauvoo at no cost to them. He would tell his wife on the way out the door, "You run the store for a while. I'm going to take these fine folks for a tour. When I asked him one time why his ancestors did not follow Brigham Young, his response was always, Brigham forgot to tell us. I guess he just wanted to leave us behind. Estelle's great-great-grandmother was Catherine Smith Salisbury, the youngest sister of Joseph Smith. Cecile's maternal great-grandfather was James Wilson, a riverboat pilot. Pay special attention to that, Paul. And one of the earliest settlers in Sonora Township in 1827. Then there was Joe Pilkington. Joe was known as a very intelligent man who had dubious common sense. Joe was a renowned local musician. He worked at various jobs such as night security man for the Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was a garbage truck owner and driver and a school bus driver. As an aside, I am now the proud owner of his former beautiful river home. As a garbage man, Joe had painted Jesus Saves on his truck with a picture of Jesus with outstretched arms, which is where the garbage would go. Nice metaphor, Joe. Joe ended his garbage business when he failed to listen to Mrs. Wolf, the Nauvoo high school teacher, who had warned him not to mix throwaway lab chemicals. His inattention caused the back of his truck to catch on fire. Joe loved all animals, especially dogs and horses. He taught many St. Mary's Academy girls how to horseback ride. Then we have the healers. On Mayberry, there was Dr. Bennett, welcoming Dr. Bennett's replacement, Dr. Thomas Peterson, at the table. In Nauvoo, we had Dr. B.C. Kampmeyer and Dr. Gundrum. Dr. B.C. Belmont Kampmeyer was a very close friend to my father. He was a very wealthy man, yet a humble man. He typically worked 6 to 7 days a week. He had a Charlie McCarthy dummy and would entertain sick children in the hospitals in which he worked during his few precious off hours. He established his office in Hamilton, Illinois in 1936 and retired, I believe it was in the 1980s. He attended Lutheran Church in Nauvoo and was a Mason. Dr. Gundrum was Nauvoo's MD. Both doctors made house calls. Dr. Gundrum always wore his Dr. Shibalgo hat in the wintertime. Dr. Gundrum was originally from Austria. Dr. Gundrum's office was located at 1360 Mulholland, currently the Quarry House Art Gallery. Then we have the healers again. Mary Simpson was the county nurse on Mayberry. Lucille Harsh was Dr. Gundrum's nurse. Carmen Harsh Orth was Lucille's daughter. She served as nurse for St. Mary's Academy and also took care of Nauvoo citizens until her death. Crone's Pharmacy in Nauvoo at 1384 Mulholland. Mr. Eldred Crone, and it was pronounced actually Crone, ran the pharmacy from 1946 to 1981. Mary Ann Schmitz-Gerlitz served as the pharmacy technician for 27 years. In 1981, the pharmacy was purchased by Luann Haas. Luann and her staff continued to provide the same high quality service to this day. Again, Eldridge Crone, pronounced Crone. Mr. Crone was a kind, loving man, but also known as a worrywart. My friends and I would buy our candy cigarettes, and what kind of candy cigarettes you would buy depending on what kind of cigarettes your father smoked. Again, for those of you in the younger generation, most Americans, the adult Americans, smoked back in the 60s and 70s. And of course, we had to try to emulate them as kids. Not a good idea. Candy bars, bubble gum, and little paraffin bottles containing juice at the pharmacy. Those little paraffin bottles, for some of you may remember those, they had pretty much a really watered down little juice inside of them. And you would quickly drink it and then chew the paraffin kind of like gum. And we have the helpers. In Mayberry, there was Barney, Goomer, and Gomer. In Nauvoo, there was Mayor Lowell Horton, 1905, 1958. In Mayberry, there was Mayor Pike. Mayor Horton ran a gas station on the corner of Mulholland and Robinson. It was said by the locals, when you stop there, you get a full tank of gas and an earful about Nauvoo. He was a tireless promoter of the town and always in favor of any new events related to tourism. Subsequent mayors include David Knowles, Hugh Pierce, Fred O'Haas, Lenford Wagamuth, John McCarty, all characters in their own way, and now Jason Skog. Mayor Skog, if you're watching, start working on your legacy as a Nauvoo character. Then we have Dr. Leroy Kimball. Starting in 1976, in my opinion, the local economy began to go downhill. Why? The loss of agriculture and blue-collar jobs in the Nauvoo area. Dr. Kimball's plan for Nauvoo was to help get the economy back on track. In 1962, Dr. Kimball organized the Nauvoo Restoration, Inc. His goal was to make Nauvoo the Williamsburg of the West, a center for history and spirituality for members of the Latter-day Saint faith and the Community of Christ faith. Restoration began in the 1970s. When I was a young boy growing up here, there was the flat were basically deserted. There were rundown brick buildings, weeds growing around it. And then thanks to Dr. Kimball, the whole flat area was transformed. To date, 22 Latter-day Saint homes and businesses have been restored. Restoration is ongoing. An LDS visitor center is open, and Nauvoo has become a major tourist attraction. It would be hard to imagine what Nauvoo would have been like today if the NRI had not started. Preston Kimball. Preston was Nauvoo's attorney at law. Many comparisons can be made with Preston and Howard Sprague, county clerk from Mayberry. Always doing the right thing, being a good son, a good Catholic, a good friend, and a neighbor was more important to Preston than becoming rich. Preston was known to treat the poor people in a very fair way. If they needed a will drawn up, he would tell them, bring in a chicken and some eggs and we'll call it a deal. Like Howard, he never married. Preston was part of Nauvoo's brain trust. Preston Kimball, Elmer Krause, hotel restaurant owner and furniture store owner, and Carl Reinhardt, banker of the State Bank of Nauvoo. These three men would meet for coffee in the mornings at Krause's cafeteria. Preston was a great friend of the LDS community and legally represented the NRI. Sam and Mary Strange at the Nauvoo Independent newspaper. Little article there about when Sam and Mary bought the Independent. Nauvoo Independent, 1900 to 1973. Up in the right hand, you're going to see the Mayberry Gazette. Pay close attention to the headline, Local Barber Captures Escaped Convicts. I'm going to come back to that in a bit. The Nauvoo Independent newspaper was operated by the Strange family in the 1960s and 70s. Sam and Mary Strange did a great job of keeping us informed back then. You could always stop by the office and chat. After the Independent closed, Jane Langford ran the Nauvoo Grapevine. It was a weekly newspaper like the Independent. The Grapevine would often come out late. Sometimes people would ask, hey, where's my newspaper this week? Typical answer, Jane's kind of feeling poorly. She'll be back soon and the press will run once more. There's really not that much that goes on around here anyway. The gossips. Emma Watson was Mayberry's town gossip. The men in town went to Stubb Starr's garage, the present location of Nauvoo Products. If the men of Nauvoo wanted to stand around and talk cars, have their cars fixed, and learn the latest gossip, this was the place to go. A high school buddy of mine, Brian McCarty, once said, I'm going to stop by Friday night after high school and hear about what kind of trouble I'm going to be getting into this weekend. For the ladies, there was Helen McGregor's beauty parlor and Larry Dusenberry's barbershop. He had a little ad in the front of his window with a picture of a man getting a haircut with a lawnmower that said, you grow it, we mow it. In Mayberry, there was Madame Phoebe and Miss Wakefield's beauty parlor and Floyd's barbershop. Now to go back to that Mayberry headline. Once, as a boy going to get a haircut on a cold, snowy January morning, my father and I were entertained as Mr. Dusenberry told the story of how his morning started. He said my wife and I were woken by the pounding on our front door. Much to my surprise, an inmate from Iowa State Penitentiary was shivering outside my door and begging me to call the police to take him back to jail. The inmate had decided to escape in the dead of winter. Larry and his wife had him come in to warm up and had him for coffee and breakfast. The phone call was made and the city policeman came to give the inmate a ride back to prison. Now, for those of you who don't know the area, the Iowa State Penitentiary is a maximum security prison housing felons of all kinds. Murderers, rapists, gangsters, and racketeers. I'm not sure if Mr. Dusenberry ever asked him what he was in for. Then we had Esther Snyder. Esther loved to listen to St. Louis Cardinals baseball. Her other hobby was sitting on the balcony, looking out the window, keeping track of the citizens of Nauvoo and wayward youth. She would promptly get the rumor mill started. Her apartment was above what was then the Nauvoo Independent. Teachers. Helen Crump, teacher in Mayberry, played by Anita Corso. Nauvoo's most memorable teachers. Three were, I did a little survey on this of different people in the area, and these were the three that got the most vote tally. For college, Western Illinois University, Dr. Lillian Snyder. Nauvoo Glucksa High School, Mr. Tom Drasler, and Nauvoo Elementary, Arlene Ann. Lillian Snyder. As the NRA begins to restore Nauvoo's LDS history, Lillian Snyder, who lived in Nauvoo and taught social work at Western, strove to promote French Icarian history. She established the Icarian Museum in Nauvoo. The artifacts are located at the Nauvoo Historical Society's Weld House today. Along with Dr. Robert Sutton, they started the Center for Icarian Studies at Western Illinois University in Macomb, Illinois. That's about 45 minutes from here. Tom Drasler. Tom Drasler, high school English teacher. In also Keokuk, and just the way you can tell a local around here is how we pronounce Keokuk. It's fast, Keokuk. He was a radio DJ and local photographer. Tom taught all sections of basic English and literature. He would take his classes to movies in Keokuk or Fort Madison to view classic films, such as West Side Story, Gone with the Wind. For many of us, Tom instilled a love of literature. He loved his students and teaching. Most technology was still on the horizon in the 1970s. Randy Bergmeyer, class of 1972, stated, Tom somehow got a 2-inch video recorder to use, which back then was nearly impossible to find. Tom sparked my love of technology, which I have to this day. Tom taught us to appreciate literature, to learn to think critically and write well. Then we had Arlene Ann. Mrs. Nan and her husband ran the Dairy Queen in Nauvoo. She was always a kind, patient, loving, funny and strict but fair lady. She was my first grade teacher. As a bright and rather precocious lad, I tested the limits early. The recess bell rang, signaling time to line up and go back into school. I kept playing. She came out to get me and asked, Randy, did you hear the bell? I replied, yes, I did. I worked way ahead in my books and workbooks, so I think I deserved to play longer. She said, Randy, that's not how it works. For the rest of first grade, I was always assigned extra homework. Later in life, I appreciated that she gave me accelerated work before it became the norm. For private education, there's St. Peter and Paul Grade School at 1115 Young Street, which opened in 1962 and still is going today. One of the favorite sisters of many St. Peter and Paul Grade School students at the time was Sister Mary David, who later changed her name to Sister Mary Jane. Sister taught first and second grade. She was an attractive young woman who was kind, never yelled, and always in control. Randy Bergmeyer, who had her for both grades, said, I always worked hard for her, learning to please her, and I got the best grades I ever achieved. The values she taught me have stayed with me my entire life. And up in the corner, you see Sally Fields, who really, back in the day on television, was the definition of a young and cute nun, played by Sally Field. Then there was St. Mary's Academy. And you can see there was a movie called The Trouble with Angels, which was a film that came out in 1966 about Catholic girls and the nuns at a boarding school called St. Francis Academy. The real deal was here in Nauvoo at St. Mary's Academy, 1874 to 1997. My St. Mary's Academy friends told me that there were very uncanny similarities. Then we have Brother Bill at St. Mary's Academy. Broadway had Hell Prince. Nauvoo had Brother Bill. For those of you that know Broadway shows, Hell Prince was really the master, and in Nauvoo, Brother Bill. Brother Bill served as a Methodist minister. He also served as a theater teacher and director for plays for both St. Mary's Academy and the local community theater. Nauvoo Glassworks artist and owner and actor himself, Jim Toppich, stated, if the stage can be a kingdom, Brother Bill was always the king. Once practice was started, there was no forgiveness for miscues or forgotten lines. Brother Bill would often point out the great actors of the past and how one was not measuring up. Also, you were going to be dishonoring the fine tradition of St. Mary's Academy. He would go on about not being only an embarrassment to yourself, but to him. To my amazement, and to many, his plays and performances were always perfect or near perfect, and astounded the packed houses at St. Mary's Academy Theater. Once the last performance of the play was done and the final curtain was drawn, Brother Bill would use praise and compliments to all those involved. There were certain memorable sisters on the screen back in the day. Sister Bertrell, Sally Fields in the Flying Nun Show, Rosalind Russell, Mother Superior in The Trouble with Angels, Deborah Kerr as Sister Angelica in Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, and Kathleen Freeman as Sister Stigmata in The Blues Brothers. Three memorable sisters at St. Mary's Academy, Sister Dolores, Sister Veronica, and Sister Joan. Again, this was the results of a survey I asked St. Mary's Academy ladies who attended. Representative couple of stories relayed to me by Patty Moffat Matthews. Sister Dolores often locked my dad, Tom Moffat, in a broom closet for being annoying. Once I passed a note to a friend in class. She asked me to stay after class. She said, the apple certainly doesn't fall far from the tree. My punishment was to clean all the windows of Mary Hall, all 3 stories. Before we students left the school grounds for downtown Nauvoo, or perhaps a trip to Fort Madison or Kilcock as a group, Sister would measure our skirt length. Of course, as soon as we were out of her sight, we would hike our skirts up with tape or pins. When she would see us upon our return, she would simply shake her head at us. Sister Veronica. St. Mary's Academy student Mindy Henderson Waters recalls Sister Veronica, who was an art teacher, having the biggest influence on her life. Mindy stated that she admired her gentle soul, her quiet strength. Mindy said Sister rounded off her rebel edges and made her a nicer person. Mindy said, she taught me never to give up on interpreting life through art in any form. Because of Sister Veronica, I still love to create art 50 years later. She will always have a place in my heart. And Mindy, I've seen her recent work, and she did good work back then and even better today. Then there was Sister Joanne, Sister Joan, pronounced Joanne, Cook. Beloved Sister Joanne taught chemistry at St. Mary's Academy and became principal there in 1969. She left Nauvoo in 1994, moving to Colorado. When she was principal, Sister began school assemblies by saying, "This is the day the Lord has made." The students' response was, "Let us be glad and let us be glad. Let us rejoice and be glad." Reverend Tucker at Mayberry's All Souls Church. Nauvoo had many religious denominations during the 60s and 70s: Catholics, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Community of Christ, and several non-denominational religions. A most dynamic cleric was Reverend Terry Clark. He was the pastor at the United Methodist Church. During the turbulent 1970s, Methodist minister Terry Clark of Nauvoo led an international youth group, the Youth Christian Organization. He asked some of the local teens and adults to start a Christian coffee house where they could socialize, perform, and listen to music, write and read poetry, create art, play ping pong, cards, or board games. The coffee house was a huge success and lasted from 1972 to 1978. Its location was where the Nauvoo city offices are today. You're going to notice this picture here. This is the members of the board of the coffee house that was created. And you can see me there with the coffee cup with the long hair and mustache. Again, when I see my friend Joseph Johnson, I have much envy for that beautiful hair he has. Wish I still had mine. You see my friends John Nauman, Dan Moffat, and Pat Waterman. I was Nauvoo's first hippie with long hair, facial hair, and beer bottoms, and my buddies quickly followed suit. Then we had Mike, known as Buffalo Leonard. Buffalo was very active at the coffee house. He may have worked more shifts than any of the other young people. Mike said the coffee house was a great place to hang out with your friends, listen to live music, which we had a lot of live music, talk to St. Mary's Academy girls, and play lots of ping pong. I always remember Nauvoo as a town with more characters French than any other town I've ever spent much time in. I still enjoy coming back to Nauvoo several times a year, seeing friends and family who live there. Mike retired in 2019, and he's currently residing in Rock Island. The business of America is business, and the ideal of the American people is idealism. Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, 30th President of the United States, 1923 to 1929. President Coolidge was a character himself. Known as Silent Cal, he was a man of few words. Flagship stores or flagship businesses during the 60s and 70s. My recollection. We have St. Mary's Academy, 1874, 1997. Buildings were demolished in 2007. Location was west of the Nauvoo LDS Temple. Then we had the Nauvoo Blue Cheese Factory, 1937 to 2003. North of what was St. Mary's Academy, northwest of St. Peter and Paul Catholic Church. A longtime employee of the cheese factory was John Jack McCarty. Jack was known to say the first shift starts at 4 a.m. The second shift starts up at the Red Front bar. Jack was a super fan of the Chicago Cubs. He had most of the 1969 Cubs team come to his house one weekend. Foley's grocery store run by Mr. Foley in Mayberry. In Nauvoo, we had Canizaro's grocery run by the brothers Dale and Jimmy, located at 1350 Mulholland, today the Christian Visitor Center. Canizaro's was representative of the typical Italian grocery of the period. It offered fantastic fresh meats, cheeses, breads, pastas, fresh produce, and homemade candies. Both brothers were kind and friendly to their customers. In Nauvoo, we also had Buss's IGA at 1285 Mulholland, at the site of the Kraus Furniture, and now the new Knights of Columbus Hall, and Laubersheimer's Grocery at 1525 Mulholland. In Mayberry, there was George the TV repairman at Monroe's Funeral Home and TV repair shop, and Weaver's department store. In Nauvoo, Johnny Brest owned and operated Brest TV store, where he sold and repaired televisions, located at what today is a Memorial Medical Clinic on Mulholland. We also had Maris's Variety Store, Val's Federated, and lastly, Creasy's Variety Store at 1209 Mulholland from 1940 to 1997, those three different variety stores. Now part of the Nauvoo State Bank. An example on the left there, Creasy's Variety Store, kind of what it resembled inside. We also had the Flavor Clean, owned and operated by Jerome and Cynthia Menke, just south of the Nauvoo Grade School. Perfect place to put a ice cream place across from a grade school. And there was the Dog and Suds, operated by Jerry and Lois Sloan. That particular chain was more of a, it started in 1953. It was more of a 60s, 70s type chain, very similar to A&W Root Beer. They featured root beer floats, hot dogs, French fries. The Dairy Queen was owned and operated by Murley and Arlene Ann, west of the Nauvoo State Park on Highway 96. And we have the Kraus Furniture Company, which was 1930 to just here recently, 2020. Lutz's Hardware, owned and operated by Otis and Loretta Lutz, pictured below. Now the location of Eborn Books across from the Red Front. The picture to the left was Gus Berger's drugstore that later became Lutz's Hardware in 1940 to 1958. Also, we had Krause's Cafeteria, which then became Grandpa John's, and Grandpa John's just closed in 2019, located at 1255 Mulholland. Kraus Movie Theater. Kraus Theater showed movies from 1951 to 1968. It's currently undergoing a renovation, hoping to be reopened. I saw many films there, as did my classmates and friends. In Mayberry, of course, there was the Grand. Mayberry Hotel, Mayberry Security Blank. In Nauvoo, Hotel Nauvoo, present. Again, probably one of the best places you can go in this whole area to get a great meal. Located at 1290 Mulholland. And then you have State Bank of Nauvoo, also present, 1893 to the present, located at 1205 Mulholland. Baxter's Winery, established in 1857, still operating today at 2010 Parley Street. The LDS Church has a visitor center and 22 restored homes and businesses. Restoration is ongoing. The business of Nauvoo today is tourism. The Community of Christ has a visitor center, 3 restored buildings, and a Smith family cemetery. In addition, there are 2 restored homes that are rentals, the Willard Richards and the Elias Sanders Inn. You can see pictures there of the LDS Visitor Center and just a representative sample of the beautiful buildings that have been restored, the print shop, Community of Christ Visitor Center, and the Red Brick Store. Annual visitor estimates vary widely from 100,000 to 250,000, primarily April through October. Of course, our numbers have been dampened due to the COVID. The Nauvoo Temple reconstructed 2000 to 2002. The original temple was started in 1841 and destroyed in 1848 by a combination of arson and a tornado. Today, open only to members of the Latter-day Saint faith with temple recommends. Fudge Factory and Pumpkin Walk, a current flagship business and event in Nauvoo. The Nauvoo Fudge Factory at 1215 Mulholland was opened in 1983 and was bought by Mr. Darrell Nelson in 1999. Mr. Nelson started the Spooky Trail Walk on Young Street in 1986. We also have the Pumpkin Walk, and its location was started in 1983, I believe. Location was moved to Mulholland in 1990. The Pumpkin Walk in beautiful Nauvoo take place every October. Beautiful Nauvoo is now the biggest one-day event in Nauvoo, averaging 8,000 to 10,000 attendees. And there's a nice picture of Darrell. What draws people to Nauvoo? There are four major tourist groups. Members of the Latter-day Saint and Community of Christ churches who come for both the spirit and history of the place. Those who come for the nature, the wine, the Mississippi River, the state park, the abundance and variety of wildlife. The best sunsets anywhere in the United States. I tell people that all the time, and they give me the old side eye, and I say, no, really. As somebody who's been to all 50 states, seen sunsets in Hawaii, California, and Florida, can't beat Nauvoo sunsets. We also have two wineries here, Baxter's and the Press House. The random traveler who just happens to be in the area or reads about Nauvoo through a paper, book, radio, or television. Event driven, beautiful Nauvoo and the Pumpkin Walk, the Festival on Wheels and the Great Festival. Christmas Merriment on Mulholland and Christmas in Nauvoo, the Scarecrow Festival, Untold Nauvoo Stories, and of course the Nauvoo and British pageants. Times change, cultures change, life moves on. Nauvoo will never return to the way it was in the 1960s and 70s. After 1976, the agricultural and blue-collar jobs went into decline. My father was a farmer and electrician. Most of those small farmers are long gone. There's larger farmers around the area now, and there a need for people who work the trades that's been declined across the country. We need a lot more people to go into electrician, bricklaying, carpentry, and such. In my opinion, the future of Nauvoo strongly lies in the Latter-day Saint and Community of Christ church leaders encouraging new business and families to move to Nauvoo. We also need to do a better job of promoting our Native American, Irish, Scot, English, French, and German Swiss history and culture by creating more events, sites, and signs or statues to celebrate these groups. Of course, those signs and sites and statues cost money, which is always an issue. Beginning in 2022, Nauvoo will celebrate both its French and German heritage. On the first weekend in July, there will be a French Heritage Weekend. In October, there will be an Oktoberfest celebrating German Heritage Day. For more information, please visit the NauvooHeritageFestivals.com or look on Facebook, Nauvoo, Illinois French Heritage Day or Nauvoo, Illinois German Heritage Day. If you love Nauvoo history, also please consider joining the Nauvoo Historical Society, website Nauvoo Historical Society. Annual membership is $25 or a lifetime membership you can purchase for $250. At the Nauvoo Historical Society, we study, research, and promote Nauvoo history, Latter-day Saint, Community of Christ, French, German, Swiss, Irish, English, Scotch, and Native American. In the May 10th, 1841 edition of the Millennial Star, published in Nauvoo, was stated by Joseph Smith, quote, Catholics, Presbyterians, Methodists, Unitarians, Mohammedans, and all other religious sects and denominations shall have free toleration and equal rights in the city. Further, it is illegal to ridicule or depreciate others because of their religious beliefs. Joseph Smith and Catholic Father Alleman's friendship gave us a good model of how people of different religious beliefs can work together to make a great town. So locals and tourists, let's make Nauvoo the Mayberry of the future. Special thanks to people who provided photographs and information and research for my presentation. Ellen Haas Hunt, Randy Bergmeyer, Mindy Henderson Waters, Leonard Hogan, Lolly Lopez down in Mexico. Hi, Lolly, if you're watching. John McCarty, Dan Moffat, Patty Moffat Matthews, Darrell Nelson, Gene and Peggy Schertz, Jim Toppich, Barb Wilkins Gates, Cindy Wilson Hagar, and Diane Wood Atchison. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Randy.
Thank you.
Our second presentation this evening will be by Michael Allen. He's Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Washington, Tacoma. He was born and raised in Ellensburg, Washington. After service as a Marine Corps artilleryman in Vietnam from 1969 to 70, he worked as a Mississippi River boat towman for 3 years. Mike earned his BA, MA, and PhD in history from respectively Central Washington State College, University of Montana, and University of Washington, Seattle. His 8 books include the award-winning Western Rivermen, 1763 through 1861, Ohio and Mississippi River Boatmen and the Boat Course. It's a good one. Mississippi River Valley, The Course of the American Civilization, forthcoming, with Larry. Boy, I'm not sure how to pronounce Larry's name there, Mike, but the bestseller, A Patriot's History of the United States. Mike lives in Ellensburg and has 3 adult children, Jim, Davy, and Caroline. He has volunteered for 12 years as a guide at the grounds, keeping maintenance, and a general gopher at the Joseph Smith Historic Site. Mike, it's up to you.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to see you bought that book, Joseph. Appreciate that. And Randy, that was a great talk. I really enjoyed that. I may have told you that I'm a member of the Andy Griffith Show Rerun Watchers Club, which means that I subscribe to their newsletter called The Bullet, after Barney Fife's Bullet. And so I look forward to talking to you someday about the Andy Griffith Show. Anyway, that's a tough act to follow, but I'll try to get started here. Let me get a slideshow up and we'll get going. Okay, I actually got the slideshow up. Amazing. Incidentally, I'd like to thank the organizers for helping me with technology on all of this. I've come a long way, and I'm going to talk to you tonight about Nauvoo as a river town, which is a phrase actually that was first turned by Dennis Rowley in a seminal article that he wrote that I'll tell you a little bit about. Nearly 40 years ago, Dennis Rowley noted that historians of old Nauvoo, Illinois, had too often viewed the town through the lens of Mormon church history and thus minimalized or overlooked its preeminence as a river town. In a seminal article in BYU Studies, Rowley placed Nauvoo in the Jacksonian socioeconomic context of its time, and I'm quoting, examining the setting and impact of the Mississippi River on selected aspects of life in Nauvoo. The early history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints coincided with a transportation revolution in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. Incidentally, that craft that you see on the right-hand side of the screen is a flatboat. We're going to be talking about them tonight. As Mormons migrated from upstate New York to Ohio, to Missouri, and to Nauvoo, Illinois, their treks paralleled significant development of riverboat traffic. Rowley, in his article, naturally focused attention on that industrialized mode of commerce, the steamboat. He told fascinating stories about Nauvoo's steamboat landings, the work of Army engineers, and Joseph Smith's brief stint as a steamboat entrepreneur and owner of the vessels Nauvoo in the Maid of Iowa. Tonight, what I'm going to do is expand on Rowley's work in a revision of an article I published in the John Whitmer Society journal. And in a small but important way, I think, include a more substantial discussion of non-steam riverboats and take the spotlight for a time off of steamboats and look more closely at flatboats, keelboats, and rafts and their construction and navigation. There remains yet unfinished and important work to uncover the social history of keelboatmen, raftsmen, and flatboatmen in Old Nauvoo. Nauvoo is called an upper Mississippi River port because it sits above St. Louis, Missouri, where the Missouri, Illinois, and nearby Ohio rivers enter, making the lower Mississippi much larger and more dangerous. Founded on a floodplain on the Mississippi's east bank, Nauvoo lay just above the beginning of a 12-mile stretch called the Des Moines Rapids, named for the river that entered the Mississippi downstream. The Nauvoo Mormons were dependent on riverboats because there was no direct railroad service to the city and because the adjacent roads were inadequate for large-scale commerce and passenger service. The optimal navigation seasons were during the high water of early spring and late fall through early freeze-ups, though early freeze-ups could complicate the latter. In 1843, Joseph Smith wrote, "The Mississippi froze up so on the 19th last and still continues so. Wagons and teams constantly pass over the ice to Montrose, Iowa." Nauvoo's charter designated the city limits extending to the middle of the Mississippi River. Now, in this map, we're going to identify some landings in Old Nauvoo. There's been some confusion among scholars about the exact number and location of boat landings. This is largely because most of the city's marshy shoreline was suitable for landing flatboats and keels and even lumber rafts, especially during high water. And so, in a sense, nearly all of Nauvoo's shoreline and riverbank was a landing. However, there were 4 important landings that were more formalized, and they served both steamboats and smaller craft. The 2 most well-known lay at the foot of Main Street near the unfinished Nauvoo House Hotel, and that's denoted by number 1 on the map here. And the far northern end of Granger Street, and that's denoted by number 2. These were called respectively the Nauvoo House Landing and the Upper Stonehouse Landing. Now, downstream from the Upper Stonehouse was where Young Street met the river, was called the Kimball Landing, and that's marked number 3 on the map. And then the Lower Stonehouse Landing was downstream from the Kimball Landing, and that was at the foot of Parley Street. The Lower Stonehouse Landing served as the ferry boat mecca, the place where the ferry boat picked up passengers and dropped off passengers that were going back and forth to Montrose, Iowa. So if you've been there today, that's where the statue of Brigham and Joseph is. That's where you watch those great sunsets that Randy was talking about in his paper. A lot of people gather there to watch the sunset at the old Lower House Landing. Now, let me tell you a little bit about boatmen and rivermen. There are exceptions to this rule, but this is the rule. The average Upper Mississippi non-steam boatman was an American-born Caucasian male of Anglo or Celtic ancestry, averaging 28 years of age. While American Indian, African, German, Franco-Americans, and some women sailed non-steam craft. They were exceptions that proved the above rule. One could further divide the demographic group into 4 professional categories. There were merchant navigators, businessmen who were also boatmen. There were professional boatmen who made a living at the trade. And there were farmer boatmen who were merchant navigators in a sense, although they usually only made 1 trip a year after harvest. and then common hands or deckhands in the modern parlance. Like their countrymen, Nauvoo's non-steam boatmen worked aboard keel boats, lighters, wood boats, rafts, and flatboats. And I'm going to explain what all these different kinds of boats were as we go along here. The merchant and entrepreneurial components of their work are complicated. Looking at Nauvoo boatmen only, it's a little more complicated because of the church ownership of steamboats and ferries and all, and the church's management of log and lumber rafting in the Wisconsin pineries. Well, there's a little background for you, and glad to take questions later. But let's go on to some specific boats and see what they look like. And I think we'll start out with keel boats that also served as lighters and wood boats. Keel boats, often called simply keels, closely resembled what modern Americans would call a large sailboat or a very small schooner. Keels were sleek, proud. When I say proud, I mean they had a pointed bottom so they could cut through water. They weren't flat-bottomed boats, they were proud. And they averaged 60 feet in length and 8 feet in width. Because they drew only 1 or 2 feet of water loaded, they could run in very shallow water on the upper Mississippi, including in the rapids and where the water was shallow and where there were rocks, because they only drew a couple of feet of water. And they could do this in the summer, early autumn, and winter, as well as the peak navigation seasons. And a good navigation season was high water on the Mississippi, especially for these non-steam craft, although a steamboat supply as well. And so that means peak navigation was late spring or late autumn when the river depth was good for navigation. Unlike raftsmen and flatboatmen, keelboatmen possess the equipment and the skills to take their crafts upstream as well as down. So of the 3 kinds of boats I'm going to talk about tonight, this is the only one that went upstream, but it took a lot of work to get it to go upstream. They used skill and muscle, and they sailed. You can see a sail there, but they also rowed and pulled and pulled. They literally get out of the boat and pull it using lines upstream. So when the steamboat came along, it put these guys out of business. This was a very inefficient way to move upstream. But the boats were around, and they served a valuable purpose even during the steamboat age. In Nauvoo, the keel boats that came sometimes came laden with goods, but more often they served as wood boats to take wood out to the steamers when they were passing, because they needed wood to fuel their engines. Now, steamboats could load wood at the different landings in Nauvoo, but if they wanted to keep moving or they didn't want to land and take time to do that, a keelboat would bring wood out to them and unload, and that was a nice way to make a living in Nauvoo. And there were a lot of wood yards in Nauvoo to supply wood to the steamboats. Another thing that the keelboats could do was to serve as a lighter for a steamboat. Lighter means lighten the load, and these steamboats had so much difficulty in the rapids, and they especially when the water was low, that they would have to unload cargo, either going upstream or downstream. Unload cargo to be able to sail through. And what the lighters did then is they go out and they would take the cargo, help them unload, and then after the steamboat got through, either going upstream or downstream, then the lighter would arrive and they would load the cargo back onto the boat, so that now that the water was deeper, the steamboat could carry that cargo. And so lighting was a very important trade in Nauvoo, and a lot of people made a good living doing that. And that's a purpose that the keel boats served. That incidentally, when we talk about the pineries in Wisconsin and all of the saints who went up there to log and to process the lumber up there. Keelboats also took a lot of their supplies up there in the upper reaches of those rivers and on that system. And so they were very important at this period of time in Old Nauvoo. Now, I think I'll talk about rafts next. And here we've got and incidentally, this image is from a 19th century a magazine, a drawing of a lumber raft. In the background, you can see a steamboat there, a side wheeler, but in the foreground is a lumber raft. And let me tell you a bit about them, log and lumber rafts. Dennis Rowley has written about the role of lumber and log rafting, the most important of the non-steam river boating in and around Nauvoo. Throughout the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, raftsmen moved cut timber to downstream sawmills. After the logs were milled, the men often rafted the finished lumber to downstream markets. And that's what Nauvoo got mostly because the logs had already been turned into lumber before they arrived in the town. Not always, but most often. Rafts were large rectangular affairs, and get this, often 300 feet long, composed of as many as 2,000 logs or an equivalent amount of sawed timber. Now, imagine trying to navigate a craft like this. There's no motorboat on this. There's no engine or anything. Imagine trying to navigate a craft that's 300 feet long. I mean, it's like a football field at times. They could get that big. Well, raftsmen built their rafts, sometimes called drifts or sticks, using techniques like those used to build a modern barge tow. They first constructed smaller rafts called stringers or blocks, and then they put them together, secured them together into large navigable units. To secure the logs or sawed boards, they strapped and pegged them together. Today, on a towboat, they use steel wire to bring barges together. These boatmen strapped and pegged them together with hickory or other deciduous saplings and strips called whaling. And some hardwood logs or lumber required metal chains or chain dogs to secure them together instead of wooden pegs. The larger rafts often had a top rail of logs or lumber nailed around the expanse's perimeter. Rafts were extremely difficult to navigate, and raftsmen steered with one or more long stern oars or sweeps. And you can, in the very back of that raft we're looking at, you can see three steersmen, and each of them has got a long oar or a sweep. And gee, did I just call the back of the raft? The back is the stern of the raft. And there you can see three oarsmen, and they've got sweeps, and they're navigating there. But it was pretty. It was a pretty rough business. To tell you the truth, the best way to proceed with a raft was just don't stop until you get to where you're going. And if you could sail at night, then so be it. But they were so difficult to land, it was better to just keep moving rather than to try to land. Raftsmen faced freezing rain, sleet, snow, fog, submerged sandbars, which are called shoals or shallows, boulders, floating debris, and especially uprooted trees were a hazard to all of these craft. Landing a raft was especially difficult without engines or backing technology. Cane brakes and marshy lowlands, such as those surrounding Nauvoo, could provide the perfect cushion in which to land such unwieldy craft. And so that swampy shoreland was real nice for landing rafts. But even at that, you can imagine coming in with the rate of the current under you, there'd be a real jolt when they hit the shore. They knew it, and probably everyone went flying when they hit the shore. But you know, this was an inexpensive way to haul timber. Now you could haul timber by steamboat, but that cost a lot of money. And this was an inexpensive way. And so really the predominant log and lumber traffic was on these rafts. Well, in Nauvoo, the most important role of the rafts was that of providing lumber for building the town initially in the early stages of the settlement, especially the early 1840s. They needed timber, they needed raw materials. And so the church organized expeditions to Wisconsin, and members of the church then went up there and logged, and there were mills up there or further downstream, and they this was called the pineries, Pineries, and they logged that coniferous wood and milled it, and then they brought it down on these rafts to Nauvoo. And that's people will always marvel at how many homes there were in Nauvoo, framed houses, in addition to brick sculptures. There were a lot of framed houses, and of course cabins and wood structures. And a lot of the wood came by way of these rafts, and it was very important as they built the town to such a large population in the early 1840s. Well, let's move to flatboats now. And you saw a flatboat when I first started the talk. This is a little different here, and this is not typical. This flatboat has an open hull. You can see right down into the hull of the boat, and would have been able to see whatever cargo or products were in there. Most flatboats had a deck over the top of this. You can see they've got a covered area for any kind of produce or agricultural product that need to be out of the weather. But ordinarily there would be a deck there, and then on the stern there'd be some kind of steering apparatus. You can see one oar on the bow of the boat, actually two oars on the bow of the boat. And then there would be a big oar or sweep on the stern of the flatboat. Well, let me tell you a little bit about flatboats now. Most upper Mississippi River boats were flatboats, which were ubiquitous. They were everywhere on the Ohio and the Mississippi River systems, and they were named for their flat bottom. They didn't have a pointed prow, a sharp prow to cut the water efficiently. They had a flat bottom, and they only went downstream. Timber rafts and log rafts obviously only went downstream unless they were being pulled by a steamboat. And so this was a downstream craft. And people always want to know, well, what'd they do with the boat after they got to their point of destination? They broke it up and sold it for lumber. And that way they could get a little bit of a return on their investment. But it wasn't much of an investment. One of the attractive characteristics of flatboats was their low cost and relative ease of construction. Even an amateur boat builder could, for about $50, bring some timber out of the woods and fashion a crude flatboat out of that timber, and take it to market and take goods to market. Flatboats were box-like craft, then averaging 50 feet in length and about 12 feet in width. Like lumber rafts, flatboats were extremely difficult to navigate because there's no engine. And as I said, probably the best policy is to try to run as much as possible. Try not to avoid tying up, because that could prove dangerous. Like lumber rafts, flatboats were extremely difficult to navigate. Boatmen steered with a long stern oar that they called the sweep, and smaller oars on the port, starboard, and bow. Flatboats ran in high water, early spring, late fall, to avoid running aground. And flatboatmen faced rain and bad weather, fog, shoals or shallows, boulders, floating debris, same kinds of hazards that keelboats and rafts faced. floating debris, especially uprooted trees, were always dangerous. And rapids were dangerous for flatboats. And high water was best. That way you're not going to run aground or run into rocks. Nauvoo proved especially troublesome because of the rapids and difficult to navigate. Flatboat cargoes varied. Corn was important, and hardy fruits and vegetables, apples, potatoes, onions, etc. Those all made excellent cargoes because they did not easily spoil in the spring and the autumn. Salted pork was a mainstay, as were animal skins and dried venison. Corn whiskey was an important product. Sometimes livestock were loaded and shipped on the hoof. Chickens sailed in crates. And while Illinois' most famous flatboatman was no doubt Abraham Lincoln, Nauvoo men also worked the trade, and non-Mormon flatboatmen traded at Nauvoo. I think probably flatboats are the least important of the for Nauvoo. Actually, in the trade in general, Nauvoo's are in the boat trade in general, flatboats at this period of time are the most important. But in Nauvoo, they're probably the least important of the craft that I've described because they'd not yet developed a heavy agricultural export trade. And the Saints left Nauvoo before they were able to do that. But this is a good example of a flatboat, and they were in and around Nauvoo. They served during the Exodus as one of the many crafts that were enlisted to ferry people across the river and accomplish that goal. Now, well, we got a little time here. I'm going to run a few slides and tell you a little. Well, let me tell you a little bit about steamboats. Talk about steamboats for a second. Yeah. Okay. We'll talk about steamboats for a second here, and but not spend quite so much time on that. And then I'll run some slides. Here we've got a steamboat that is called the Comet, and Nauvoo in the background. You can see the temple barely, and that's a side-wheeled steamboat. And most of the artists who did images of Nauvoo would do side-wheelers because it was more difficult from the shore to paint or to draw a stern wheeler. Here you can see the entirety of the wheel. There were more stern wheelers than there were side wheelers on the western rivers, but almost all of the paintings and drawings of Nauvoo show side wheelers, and so you get a pretty good view of a steamboat there. Steamboats had navigated the western rivers for over 25 years by the time of Nauvoo's founding, as Flanders and Raleigh have shown, and these craft played a colorful role in Nauvoo's early history. To learn about the technology and design of upper Mississippi steamboats, one must immediately forget gaudy images of Hollywood movie steamers and huge modern tourist boats like the Mississippi Queen. The typical 19th century steamboat was, above all, a workboat. Though some steamboats sported fancy trappings and luxurious amenities, most did not. Most steamboats were small, 300-ton, maybe stern wheelers with a shallow draft suitable for navigating low water depths. Powerful boilers, average lifespan was 5 years. Boats carried a 10 to 12 man crew, including a captain, a pilot, engineer, mate, and deckhands. Upper Mississippi River steamboats ran whenever they could, but peak shipping was the same as flats, keels, and rafts, and that is high water. And the high water of late fall and late spring. Steamboatmen also faced danger from fog and freezing temperatures, as well as floating and sunken logs, cave-in banks, and shoals. In 1824, Congress created the Army Engineers which we now know today as the Corps of Engineers, to alleviate some of the worst river hazards through federally subsidized internal improvements. The stretches of the Mississippi directly above and below Nauvoo proved particularly challenging. Near Davenport and Keokuk, Iowa, two respective sets of rapids, known to rivermen as the upper and the lower rapids, have stymied rivermen ever since the keelboat days. And one of the Army engineers actually working out of Rock Island, but in the same area of the river here was Robert E. Lee. And you probably heard that story before. Well, as I said, I'm going to not spend too much time on steamboats. Let's run a few slides here. And you've probably seen most of these pictures before. I hope I got a couple of new ones for you. And we'll look at the boats here. In the foreground is a very small flatboat, a very small flat bottom boat. And the pilot's got a pole there that he's using with it. But to the right of that small boat is a larger, and you can barely make it's in the shadows, but there is a larger flatboat. And we're going downstream here. This is kind of an interesting view, not looking directly at Nauvoo, but looking downstream at Nauvoo. Now, this is a famous painting, and we can see a couple of boats pretty clearly here. On the left, moving upstream, is a steamboat, but it's a side wheeler. You can see there's kind of a rounded wheel on the side of the boat, and one on the other side, and that's a paddle wheel that helped push the boat upstream. Now, on the shore, you see the sailboat there. That's a keelboat, and pretty good sized keelboat. And downstream from the keelboat, there's a wood yard with a lot of stacked logs, and wood yards were common around Nauvoo. And so this shows us the connection between the keelboats and the wood yard, and perhaps the keelboat was a wood boat and took lumber or took wood out to the steamboats for their power. Now, this is David Hiram Smith's painting of Old Nauvoo. This was done around 1860, and we can see two boats here. There's a small keelboat with a sail on the left-hand side, and then below it is a small lumber raft, actually too small. This is a little out of proportion, but we can see oarsmen on the bow and oarsmen on the stern. They got a little shanty. You notice they built a little shanty there, and that was common on these lumber rafts. So to get out of the weather and also to do some cooking. And people always want to know how come they didn't burn the raft down. They had a sandbox. They had a sandbox on the raft, and then they could light a fire and wouldn't burn the whole thing down. Okay, and then we've got another steamboat there. Well, let me make a few concluding remarks. In conclusion, Nauvoo's fleet of keels, lighters, rafts, flatboats, and steamboats forms an important part of the history of Old Nauvoo. These river boats and their crews transported the residents into, around, and out of the city. They carried visitors and new converts to its landings. They imported much needed lumber and supplies and manufactured goods, and occasionally even brought professional entertainers to Zion's Landing. In turn, the fleet carried excess produce to markets outside the city and assisted a thriving steamboat trade. Boats loom large in the traditions and legendary tales of the Nauvoo Latter-day Saints. The most famous story of the Mormon exodus from Nauvoo spotlights members in wagons, on horseback, and on foot, carrying push carts crossing the frozen Mississippi River in the dead of winter. Yet a far greater number of immigrants fleeing Nauvoo crossed the Father of Waters in keelboats, lighters, flats, skiffs, and steamboats. Indeed, the exodus of approximately 12,000 Mormons from Nauvoo by boat across the river could be said to constitute a small restoration precursor to the World War II evacuation from Dunkirk in France. Although Joseph's widow, Emma, refused to accompany the emigrants, boats played an important part in her continuing story. She had fled with young Joseph III and his siblings to Fulton City, Illinois, until learning in February of 1847 that Abram Van Tool, the man she had hired to manage the Mansion House Hotel, was planning to use her absence as an opportunity to rob her. Roger Delanius writes in Joseph Smith III, Pragmatic Prophet, Van Tool planned to build a flatboat on the Mississippi River, take all the furniture and valuable goods from the mansion, and head downriver before the Smiths returned to Nauvoo. Emma packed up the children, rushed home to Nauvoo, surprised the thief, and with the aid of the county sheriff, she literally threw him out of the house and reopened the mansion under her own management. Over a decade after Emma squashed the flatboat robbery scheme, Joseph III, now a young man, was called to lead the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm going to take my father's place at the head of the Mormon Church, he wrote in a historic letter to William Marks. On April the 4th, 1860, Joseph III and his mother, now Emma Smith Bideman, set out to a meeting of the reorganized church in Plano, Illinois. To make railroad connections, they crossed the Mississippi River by boat. Their journey, though not as grand as the vast 1846 exodus from Nauvoo that preceded it, was nevertheless momentous. Boarding a leaky rowboat, the two bore across the current with two friends helping Joseph to row. As the wind strongly blew and waves washed water into the boat, Emma blamed it all on the devil. Whenever she was facing church activities, and I'm quoting, "The old boy, the devil, seems to be in the elements trying to prevent it," she claimed. Joseph reportedly used his shoe to bail water out of the rowboat. Thus, the creation of the RLDS Church was itself launched, as it were, in a leaky skiff crossing the mighty Mississippi River. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, both Randy and Mike, sharing those terrific and interesting papers with us this evening. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we'll bring this evening's program to a close, as well as the 2022 Untold Nauvoo Story Symposium. So thank you again, Randy and Mike. This has been very delightful. And
Thank
of
you.
course, Paul and Bob from last night. Thank you to the both of you.
Peace and love to everybody. Peace and love.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you people who've been working behind the scenes to make this possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You know who you are, but you don't want to be named, so I'm not going to name you. And also, again, thank you to our generous sponsors, the City of Nauvoo, the Nauvoo Area Chamber of Commerce, the Nauvoo Tourism Office, the Joseph Smith Historic Site, and Historic Nauvoo. Thank you for your continuing support. And lastly, of course, we want to thank each of you, our friends in the audience, who've joined us this weekend and expressed your appreciation for Nauvoo's rich heritage. So in closing here, it's my pleasure to announce that the dates for the 2023 Untold Nauvoo Symposium. We look forward to seeing each of you, including Mike. You'll have to come on back.
Heck yeah.
For the February 3rd and 4th next year, 2022. And everyone, please join me in collectively knocking on wood that they will be in person. Okay. Now, for any of you who have not experienced Nauvoo's in the wintertime, you need to come and see it embraced. And just the snow-covered pioneer homes, the frozen Mississippi, the bald eagles, and of course, the great history. It's a different kind of beautiful Nauvoo than you can experience in the summer months or spring or even fall. Regardless of whether in person or online, please, everyone, be sure to mark your calendars because it will definitely be a weekend you don't want to miss. And to learn more about our annual symposium, please check on our website, untoldnauvoostories.com. And on behalf of Untold Nauvoo Story Symposium Committee, I wish to I wish all of you a safe and enjoyable 2022. Good night.
Night.